today we're going to be talking about the 10 biggest mistakes that I see people making when learning how to crochet. I first learned how to crochet when I was like 8 or 9. I did it for like a year and then I stopped for a while. I picked it back up in high school where the muscle memory in my hands came back pretty quickly, but I still needed to learn a lot of basics. So I watched a lot of YouTube videos. A lot of it was trial by error when I was relearning. It's been 12 years since I first started high school, which is really insane to think about. It makes me feel really old. I am 25, almost 26, so that tells you how much experience I have with crochet. So I wrote down a couple things that I struggled with when I first was relearning how to crochet and things that I've seen other people struggle with learning how to crochet from me teaching them how to crochet. So number one, this came with experience from myself. When I first re-picked up how to crochet, I did not know how to make a slip knot. I was actually teaching this younger girl how to crochet, and I literally used to just like tie a knot and put it on the hook and call it good. I would put the yarn around my hook and just tie a knot and hope for the best. But this girl actually came back and told me like, hey, here's how you make a slip knot. And I was like, this is amazing. Know how to make a slip knot. It helps a lot when starting a project, keeping the same tension. Slip knots are just very fundamental. So know how to make one and don't make the same mistake that I did. Number two, one of the biggest mistakes that I see, and I actually helped with my sister last week, making your foundation chain on a free-handed project way too big. When you're a beginner, everyone is guaranteed to hit a certain point and say, I want to freehand my own blanket. It happens to everyone. Usually what happens is you just make a giant chain that you think is about the right size for a blanket, and it tends to be so big. The likelihood that you're gonna actually finish that ginormous blanket is very slim. My sister messaged me the other day and told me she had picked up crochet because we both learned it around the same time, and she was making a blanket and she sent me a picture of it and it was like, that looks really big. So I videoed her and had her hold it up with the length of her body to see how long it was, and it was like a good foot longer than her body, and she's about the same height as me, like 5'4". So it was ginormous. And I told her, you're just picking up crochet, it's been a while, you're gonna quit this project. Like, you're not gonna want to finish this project. That initial chain was way too big. Knowing that I struggled with this, knowing that beginners always struggle with this, I made a pattern called the Square Stitch Calculator. This pattern allows you to make sure that you start with the right amount of stitches for the size that you want to make. So you can input exactly the square by square measurements that you'd like, and I even have a chart at the end of the table saying what a queen size blanket is, what a lap blanket is. It works for anything square, so you could also do like a pillowcase, a washcloth, and all you have to do is make a little sample square of stitches and rows and measure that out, input that into the pattern, and I will tell you exactly how many stitches and rows you need to make for the size you actually want to make. This pattern also allows you to calculate how many yards of yarn you're going to be using if you weigh your gauge that you made. So you know how much yarn you're going to need to buy to make this giant blanket as well. The third thing that I see a lot of beginners do is not reading the pattern fully throughout before starting it. Something that I did as a beginner is, one, I looked for a lot of free patterns, but before I actually started into the pattern, I would read through the entire pattern, make sure that yes, I can do all these, maybe look up stitches that I'm not super familiar with to see if I could accomplish those, see if the pattern even makes sense. Sometimes free patterns out there are very confusing. Save yourself the headache. Make sure you read the pattern throughout. Along with reading patterns, so number 4 is missing the row repeat instructions. I wish I had it with me. I'll try to find a picture of it, but something that I made when I first got back into crochet is I wanted to make a stuffed animal, and I made a Batman. The instructions had the arms and the legs of the Batman. It said row 2 through 5, so it had like 2-5 on it. I completely missed that and just read it as row 2, do this instruction. So the Batman was like super small arms and legs and looked really silly. That's one of my mistakes. I don't know if everyone else has made that mistake, but just be sure to pay attention to how the designer writes the row instructions of repeating row instructions. Sometimes they do in parentheses, sometimes they do in brackets. You just really have to pay attention to those row repeats. Number 5 is fiber matters. When working with different fibers with a project, know that each fiber has its own specific characteristics. For example, cotton actually doesn't stretch that much. So if you're making like a nice crop top, maybe you'd want cotton rather than acrylic because acrylic stretches out. If you want a little bit more tight formed, you might want cotton. If you're making like a beanie, I would maybe do something not cotton. Acrylic characteristics are that it is pretty stretchy. It is not resistant to heat. So if you're making a pot holder or something that is gonna be having heat on it, maybe even a coaster, it's not gonna handle heat very well, and especially with high heat situations, it could melt. So just knowing how all these different fibers work is really important as a beginner. I really didn't understand this even until a couple of years ago. I didn't really pay attention to fibers. Now that I've worked with a lot of different fibers, I can totally see the differences between all of them. And along with different fibers, number 6 is how to block different fibers. So to quickly go over blocking, blocking is a way that you can just kind of stretch and move the stitches in a project to be more uniform. Sometimes tension is a little uneven, so you can stretch all that out. You can make sure everything is the right height because sometimes it gets a little condensed, and the fibers can stretch out a decent amount, and that's what blocking's for. When it comes to specific fibers, there's different ways that you can block. So when it comes to acrylic, you actually cannot block with just water. You're gonna have to steam and use a little bit of heat. Obviously, you don't wanna use tons of heat because acrylic can melt, but we're not talking like extreme cooking heat. We're just talking a little bit of steam, and that is the only way you can block acrylic. When it comes to wool, cotton, and any animal fiber, really natural fiber, you can use just wet block. You don't even need to use steam at all. You can use steam, but it's not required. Number 7 is how to properly hide your ends in a project. So when it comes to hiding ends, I see so many beginners just talking about, I just knot it off and cut it off right away. And oh, that scares me so much because your project could become completely unwoven, and you don't want that to happen. You worked so hard on your project. Something you have to do is you definitely want to fasten off your end, but you want to weave in your end in your project to make sure that it won't come undone. And there's multiple ways you can do this. You can look up more specific videos on how to do this, but mainly how I do it is just hide it underneath the stitches of the other rows, and I go back and forth at least 2 times. Someone had a really good analogy for me for this. If you grew up in the 90s, early 2000s like I did, there's something called a Chinese finger trap where you put your 2 fingers on either end, and if you stretch it with your fingers get stuck. It's kind of something like that, where if you go back and forth and you stretch your project, it won't come out as easy. And that's something you wanna do so you don't ruin your project. So I recommend looking up some videos on how to properly hide your ends and just practice. Number 8. Number 8 is how to make straight edges. Having straight edges on a crochet project takes a lot of practice. You're not gonna get it right away. I'll put a picture of something I made when I was first learning how to crochet and how amazingly straight my edges are. Just kidding. You have to do a lot of practice for this, but I can give you a couple tips in doing so. Number 1 is just, you need to count. Crochet takes a lot of counting. I know it sucks, but when I first learned how to crochet, I would just count every single stitch as I was doing it and make sure my end stitch in each row was the same amount of stitches. And this is a really easy way to instantly catch your mistakes and not having to get rid of a lot of rows when you finally catch it. Another thing that can help is adding a little stitch marker on the very last stitch you do in a row. That way you make sure to always go into it when you come back to it, because that is a stitch that gets missed a lot that can make you not have straight rows, and make it so your stitch count becomes off. And then one other thing is turning chains. So turning chains are important to keep the edges of your crochet project straight. A turning chain is the amount of chains you do at the end of the row to match the height of your stitch. For a single crochet is just 1. For half double crochet, it's usually 2. Double crochet, it's 2 or 3, and you just go up and up as the stitch increases height. So making sure that you do your turning chains at the end can also help with keeping straight edges on your crochet projects. Number 9, I touched on this a little bit, but not making a gauge swatch. When it comes to making a project that is very specific in what size it needs to end up being, for example, like a cardigan or something wearable, not making a gauge swatch can completely change the size and what you're making. And it just makes all the work that you did thrown out the window. Once again, making a gauge swatch is just crocheting a little square that is this many stitches by this many rows, and you measure it, the width and height, and make sure that those measurements are exactly the same as the pattern that you're following. So if you're following a pattern, they'll usually put a gauge on there, and that is what they used for their calculations when making the sizes for their pattern. So if you don't have that same gauge swatch, your pattern's gonna become completely different even though you followed their instructions, because your gauge is different from what they were using when making those calculations. So you definitely want to make sure you make a gauge before you start a project. I don't fasten off. I always just make it, measure it, and then undo it. That way I can save that yarn for the actual project. It takes a little bit of extra time, but I would much rather take that time instead of making the entire thing and realize it doesn't fit or is not the right size. Last and final mistake that I see a lot, this is kind of similar to the last one about the gauge, and that's when people use a different weight of yarn for a pattern and expect it to come out exactly the same as the pattern they're following. So this has a lot to do with gauge. If you use a thicker weight of yarn, your gauge is gonna come out bigger than what the pattern designer's gauge was because they're using a smaller weight of yarn. Similarly, if your weight that you're using is smaller than the weight that they used, it's not gonna work. Your gauge is gonna be smaller than theirs, and so the ending project is gonna be way smaller. If you're making a garment pattern and you do a crazy different weight than what the pattern suggests, that is gonna drastically change the fit of what you're making. So there you have it. There are 10 common mistakes that I see people making when they first learn how to crochet, including me. I made a lot of these mistakes. If there are any mistakes that you think I missed, definitely comment them down below and let me know. We all need to learn from each other's mistakes so we become amazing crocheters. If you're not subscribed to me already, I would absolutely love it if you subscribed and like this video if you found this helpful. And thank you so much for watching.